That's great. Well, we're going to focus on local here, although you, in your book, your great new book, which is titled Backroom Deals in Our Backyard, How Government Secrecy Harms Our Communities and the Local Heroes Fighting Back. It's just published last month by Miranda S. Miranda Spivack. And Miranda is a longtime journalist, investigative reporter and editor, specializing in stories about government accountability and secrecy. She spent 20 years as an editor and reporter for the Washington Post. And before that, she was a reporter for the Hartford Courant. Important press Herald, other publications. She's also taught journalism at American University, University of Maryland, and DePauw University. And the book, as I said, was just published last month. Congratulations on that. I want to start by defining the key term, backroom deals. You're not just talking about bribery and corruption, even though that's what we sometimes think of when we hear the term backroom deals, but it's a bigger concept than that. Why don't you explain that?
Yeah, I think it is. I think you're right. The first thing that comes to mind is bribery and corruption, and often backroom deals include that or embrace that. But what I'm really talking about in the book, in most instances, are issues that are sort of kitchen table issues, come up in people's lives. They go to their local government, they think they're going to get help, and lo and behold, they find out that, the local government has already made a deal with the data center or the developer or, the polluter or whatever, and really people who come in are sort of left out. And so there may not be a payoff involved necessarily, but there's a lot being done behind closed doors and then sprung on the community. I think that might be familiar to people here in Massachusetts.
Sure. In fact, one of the case studies that you cover takes place in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Get to that in a minute. Your book tells the story of 5 individuals you call them local heroes and accidental activists. And they define themselves as accidental activists, people who are investigating wrongdoing on the part of the government or corporate entities. I wonder, though, are they really accidental, or were there things that you found common among them?
Yeah.
That either the types of experiences that happened to them, or something about their place in the world or in the community that allowed them or forced them to get involved and become activists?
Yeah. I think they are accidental activists. I don't really think anybody signs up for this. It's very time-consuming to go to bat against your government or the local industry or whatever. It's not a lot of fun, and it's a lot of hard work. And what happened in all of these cases was people, something did go wrong that affected either them or their family or their immediate community, and they go to the government. They think the government's there to help, that cliche. And they're sort of surprised, when they're sort of pushed away or turned off, or in the case of the mayor of Hoosick Falls, New York, when the fellow I write about in the book, Michael Hickey, goes and says, "Hey, I think we got forever chemicals in our drinking water," and the mayor says, essentially, paraphrasing, "Don't tell anybody." It's sort of like, what? And so they're all different personalities. I mean, he's actually a very reserved, shy person. He hates the limelight. Aaron Brockovich wanted to meet with him, and he did not meet with her. He testified in Washington, and he hated doing that. But I think what happens is that people get really frustrated, they're angry, they're surprised that they're not getting help, and they are very tenacious, and that's probably the common thread. Is that somebody says no to them, and they're like, what? And they keep pushing. But they all sort of went about it a little bit differently.
You wrote that the 5 accidental activists, and quoting, taught themselves to identify and then investigate and expose state-sponsored secrecy. And it made me think, they taught themselves. What is the role in our society of academic journalism or professional journalism in extending a hand and helping them rather than forcing them to reinvent the wheel on
Yeah.
their own?
Well, I think that's really a good question, because what happens in most of these cases is these people are operating in what I would call news deserts. So local news has declined, if not disappeared, including there's one in suburban Washington, D.C. I worked in the Post. You know, the Post has gone from deep coverage of the communities to no coverage of the community, thank you, Jeff Bezos. And, you know, I think that these people don't have any tools. They have no guidance. And really, you know, I as a journalist, okay, I know what I'm entitled to get in the way of public records. I know how to force the government to give it to me, and I know how to fight back. And that's obviously part of what we do professionally. But no, I don't think we've shared the information with the public in the way that we should. And now I think with these coverage gaps and lack of local news, you know, who's going to show up at midnight when the city council is doing its backroom deals? Because they do it when they think you're not looking. And it's often local residents. So yes, I think academic journalism, there's a movement in Chicago called documenters. I don't know if you're aware of that, but they're training people, civilians, if you want to call them that, to go out and go to public meetings and write about them. And you know, they're explaining about conflict of interest. You can't cover an issue that you're involved in. Fundamental things like that journalists know, but I don't think they do as far as the public. That's really a great question.
Well, thank you. So let's talk about Worcester, Massachusetts. One of your examples takes place there. A firefighter was diagnosed with cancer. His wife ended up investigating cancer clusters in firehouses. Came up against the nonprofit National Fire Protection Association, which
Right,
is
here
based
in Quincy, Massachusetts.
Yeah, they are. As well as the Firefighters Union, the toxic gear manufacturing companies, and politics. So how did the local politicians help or hinder her investigation into what was happening with firefighters in Worcester?
So this is a really interesting case. This woman, Diane Cotter, she's a high school graduate, hairdresser, absolutely no organization training, investigative training, nothing, which is essentially what most of the people in the book are like. But I think she's a particularly pronounced case because she didn't go to college. You know, she just has no exposure to this world until her husband gets cancer. He can't continue working. She's really bereft and starts to teach herself how to get on the internet and try to figure out what's going on. And ultimately, she does come to her environment. Finds out that there are forever chemicals in firefighter, what's called turnout gear, which is the PPE, the protective gear. And that's basically like wearing Teflon. And so, you know, there's a reason for that. I mean, you go into a fire, there's hot water, there are chemicals, there are all kinds of things. You do not want to penetrate your gear. I understand that. But what happens is that this gear can last for 10 years because it's very expensive. It's about $1,000 per ensemble. Municipalities cannot afford to replace that gear, you know, every 3 or 4 years, which is probably when it needs to be replaced. And it degrades, and so it's been flaking off into the bodies of firefighters. I mean, her husband's gear was 10 years old. And the incidence of cancer in the fire service is higher than in the general public. And there are other reasons for that. But she really, you know, like fighting a toxic fire, which is really probably most fires now. But she really was able to connect the gear with the possibility that this was another contributor to cancer. And the union, the International Association of Firefighters, which is got 300,000 members in the U.S. and Canada, and is in pretty tight with the gear manufacturers. They advertise in their publications. Sometimes firefighters, as a part-time job, sell gear to, you know, fire departments. They all sit together on this National Fire Protection Association based in Quincy. And that's a private organization, but it functions as the organization that tells governments what gear to buy, what's safe. You know, it's a safety organization. And there are others, you know, there's like the electrical association that also, but you know, this is the government relying on an outside organization, which by the way has no conflict of interest rules, which I asked them about. And you know, there are firefighters on the panels, there are scientists on the panels, there are government people on the panels, and there are gear manufacturers on the panels. And what Diane figured out was maybe people had a vested interest in perpetuating the current system, but maybe it wasn't the best system. Eventually, the union had a new president, Ben Kelly, who's from Boston, and he listened to her, whereas the prior administration did not. And they have now gotten behind the idea to, fix the gear, make it without forever chemicals if at all possible, and to get the word out that, this may be a problem. Cause and effect has not been proven yet, but, it's probably a good thing.
When it comes to their health and safety, sometimes don't pay enough attention to.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, the firefighters finally will say, the gear that's supposed to protect us may be poison.
Mm-hmm. So at that time, the Attorney General of Massachusetts was one Maura Healey.
Yes.
How did she involve herself or not?
Well, Diane, who had no political experience really, was trying every door she could knock on. This woman sent 22,000 emails in not to Healy, but in general to, people she was trying to contact. She thinks she sent about 200 emails to Healy, and she wanted Healy to look at NFPA, which is in Massachusetts, to, figure out why the firefighters union in the state maybe was pushing back against her and blackballing her, not Healy, but Diane. And she just thought it was worth looking at. It was happening right in Healy's backyard. And, Healy, as Attorney General, did not respond to her, to the best of my knowledge. She did eventually sue some of the companies that produce firefighter foam, which is used, and it's also a source of forever chemicals, and it's used, this foam is used to put out fires, especially in military bases and at airports, and that has a lot of forever chemicals. So she finally did get involved, but Diane will tell you that she does not feel like Healy really ever gave her the time of day. And Diane and I are going to talk on those tomorrow night.
You focus on local journalism. I think when the general public thinks about investigative journalism, they think about Watergate, right? They think about national investigations. Watergate's the first one, but there are others. Why do you think that is? Since really most investigative journalism does take place in the local level.
Well, I mean, Watergate started as a local story, which I assume is what you're saying. I mean, those two guys, Woodward and Bernstein, were now big shots, but they were little shots done on the Metro staff of the Washington Post. And, it was a police reporter who got the tip about the break-in at the Watergate headquarters of the Democratic Party. And, they pursued it relentless. They were unrelenting in going after it. And, I wasn't at the Post then, but there were internal battles eventually about, which staff was going to get control of this story, and they hung on to their credit.
Yeah. But I mean, when people think about investigative journalism, a lot of times they think about FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, which is on the national level. It was enacted in 1966, revised over the years. What was the impact, you think, of FOIA overall, and is it still have the same impact?
That's a big question. Well, every state has a public records law that's patterned after the Federal Freedom of Information Act. Massachusetts has one. Every state has one. I think the impact, at least for the first 40 years or so, was pretty good, which was it sort of caused an awareness about what public records were, why the public was entitled to get them after all their tax dollars had already paid for all this information and material. And, I think in general, it forces governments to think about being more forthcoming with information and more transparent. What's happening now, at least in Washington, is a disaster for open government, and Trump has fired half the FOIA officers and federal agencies, and even before Trump, I had in one of the stories in the book in Alabama, the fellow there had filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I also did, because I wanted to get the same information he was getting. And it took 2 years and they didn't respond, and only a federal judge finally ordered them to respond. So, you know, how effective, it's a great idea, and on paper the laws are good. How the enforcement is very varied across the country.
And how does Massachusetts compare with the rest of the country?
You know, it's a mix. I know that there was a case here where I think it was the state police wanted $1 million to provide public records to a defense lawyer. I mean, crazy stuff like that. It's not unique, though. I would say, you know, Massachusetts is probably one of many states that is hardly at the top of the game on this. You know, and why do public officials want to keep information secret? I mean, apart from what we may think and what conspiracies there may be, often they don't know where the material is, it's not digitized, they're underfunded, nobody wants to be the records officer in the government, that's hardly a career builder. You know, so there's sort of an indifferent culture about being transparent. It's the nicest way I could put it.
All right, that's nice. What is your advice for people living in news deserts when they see potential injustice? How should they approach this problem?
You know, one of the thing about the people in the book is that they are self-taught, so they did learn about public records. They did learn how to file public records requests, which people should learn, but they should also, I think, go to the government in person if possible. Try to befriend the clerk who knows where all the documents are, who knows how they're kept. You know, try to just cultivate people before you meet them. And that's really, journalists should do this too, and at least when I was coming up, that is what we did. Spend a lot of time developing sources before you meet them. Also have to really learn to organize your community and make sure you get the word out. So all those neighborhood listeners are very useful communications tools. People should use them. Interestingly enough to me in the book, they also used Facebook a lot. And, you know, I have daughters in their 30s who are like, oh, we don't use Facebook. Well, guess what? The rest of the world is using it, and it's a good organizing tool. And of course, the other thing is that there's strength in numbers. And so if you go to the local city council and say, oh, I have a problem in my neighborhood, yeah, okay. But if you go and say, 50 of us signed this letter and we have a problem in our neighborhood and we want you to fix it, they will pay attention to it. So, you know, networking, organizing, sharing the burden, because this is hard work. Don't shoulder it all yourself. Try to find people you can work with. And, you know, but I think communicating through, you know, social media and neighborhood listservs is a really useful way to get the word out.
So, well, I want to just say, I've been speaking with Miranda Spivack, author of the brand new book, Backroom Deals in Our Backyards, How Government Secrecy Harms Our Communities and the Local Heroes Fighting Back, because solutions. Published last month by the New Press.